Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Not So Nerdy Actuary. Today, I have with me Mr. Rajsekhar Muthukumar, who is an underwriter for property and political violence. Apart from him, I have Mr. Kevin Pledge. He is the CEO of Acceptiv and an actuary. And apart from him, I have with me Neil Raden. Neil Raden just wrote a paper on ethics in AI for SOA, and he's a consultant and an author as well. So today we'll be discussing about this survey, which came out by Society of Actuaries, and it was titled "Emerging Issues in Underwriting Survey Report." So this survey report included a lot of companies from US and Canada. To be specific, 33 companies, including the companies like Allstate, Sun Life Financial, Manulife, and all other life insurance companies. So it came out with the emerging issues, and majorly it covered the issue of impact of genetic testing. How do they differentiate between sex and gender? How is marijuana, e-cigarettes, financial underwriting, advances in medical technology, communication, behavior economics? But the thing which we'll be discussing majorly about today are the new data sources, as well as the use of social media, and a debate around, or to say better, discussion around ethics of AI and how to have an ethical framework under which we use AI. So, uh, Kevin, if you would like to give a very short overview of this to start with.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, this paper has just come out from the Society of Actuaries, and I wasn't involved in the drafting of it, and but a couple of things struck me reviewing it. I work in life underwriting, and so I was quite surprised by the range of responses on some of the questions. Some things that are a matter of fact, and you think these are factual, like the use of genetic tests in Canada. But where it seemed to read that people said, yeah, maybe we can do this and maybe we can do that. That should be pretty much clear cut, not a matter of opinion. And also another general feeling I got from it is some of it felt like the underwriters are working in isolation rather than part of a larger sales process. So it's, particularly the section on sex and gender, where maybe there is a bigger customer service perspective to consider. The survey itself was, I think, went out in the middle of 2019. So it was just after the New York circular letter, which came out in January of that year, to talk about the use of the regulations around using AI and accelerated underwriting. And it was before the letter from the Center for Economic Justice, which came out in 2020, which was really much more focused on the use of these data sources. So Section 10 of the report covers the other data sources, social media and new data sources to some extent. It's really it's what the section's about. It doesn't cover all the data sources. And so I thought, it'd be quite good to discuss some of the issues around this. I think, to be fair to the survey, obviously it was commissioned at a time before a lot of thoughts were developed. And we have Neil Raden. Neil wrote the ethical use of AI for the Society of Actuaries, was end of 2019. So, Neil, maybe you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Neil Raden, and I actually was an actuary for quite some time, many years ago, in the P&C side. But I've been a consultant and an author and I don't know what else you'd call it, but I got interested in the ethics of AI, I guess 3 or 4 years ago, because I got worried about some of the things I saw. And everybody knows what these iconic disasters are. The Compass system that put Black people in prison 3 times longer than white people, and Amazon's recruiting thing that characterized Black people as gorillas. And maybe that seems funny now, but it's not funny because that's still a problem. And the reason it's a problem is because machine learning, in particular. Oh wait, I'm already talking about the topic now. I was supposed to introduce myself. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I have I don't know. I have a whole bunch of kids and grandkids, and I've known Kevin for over 20 years, and we've worked together on a number of things. But I publish every month 4 articles on a site, and about half of those cover AI or AI ethics. So this is something that I'm very interested in.
Okay, thank you, Neil, for that introduction. So, Kevin, after going through the section 10, which specifically relates to external data, what do you think are the major issues out there when it comes to the data, like using external data or using sources of external data, and what kind of ethical issues are there which need to be addressed?
Yeah, let's think back to 2019 when this would have been completed. So at that time, we still went to live meetings. We still met people in person. And I recall going to meetings and the New York letter being discussed. And a lot of the general attitude early on was, how can we address this? How can we convince New York that they're wrong, that we're not doing anything wrong here? And that changed. That was just my personal feeling, read on the sentiment. I'm not sort of trying to say that there was anything wrong in the way it was received. I just think that it was initially a bit defensive, like going through the 7 stages of grief. We were still on denial. And so specifically, one of the questions here asks, have you made any adjustment to your underwriting in response to New York Circular number 1? So let me just explain that. That New York Circular talks about the law. It doesn't say, we think you should be doing this or you should be doing that. It says very factually, this is the law as required, as it set out. This you cannot be biased against protected groups. You have to have transparency in how you make decisions. And if you accelerate a decision, that is given an advantage. So if you accelerate a decision for one group of people and you don't do it for another group, you're giving that group an advantage. And so they set that out very, very factually. And it really talks about the ethics of it. Although it's a New York Circular letter, I think it was a very clear argument and very well set out, and really shouldn't have been much debate around it. And then when you read this question, the responses, some people said, well, no, we're not in New York, but you should feel that ethics are a bit more universal than just applying to the jurisdiction of New York. But in the context of 2019, I think we were still in, it did shock a lot of people that it was so clear cut and that it come out then. Following that, the Center for Economic Justice produced a letter that I think was also very meaningful and a lot of people took attention to. And that was really to say, look, we've got to stop doing this. We've got to stop using some of these data sources. And there's a secondary bias coming in. For example, if you're using motor vehicle records and you're really sort of counting it, well, some people, because of their race, they get stopped more than others. And so they're going to have a worse record. And it doesn't mean anything. That's just inherent in the bias. So unless you can demonstrate that you're not being biased in your underwriting decision or in your ability to accelerate, we would like to, this should stop. And they, especially that one called out the use of credit scoring data, which is also mentioned in this survey. I know Neil feels very, very strongly about some of these things. Neil, did you want to add anything?
Well, when I was working on the project for the SOA, I interviewed the chief actuary of the New Mexico Insurance Division, and I was very surprised at what she said. She said, look, New Mexico is the 5th largest state in the United States, and there are only 2 million people in it, and half of them are poor. And when you look at automobile insurance, it's like a regressive tax on the working poor because it's mandatory and it's expensive. And when they use credit rating, they get hurt even more. And it's not fair because they don't have a low credit rating because they're bad people or bad risks. They have a low credit rating because they don't have enough money. And I do feel very strongly about that. And I did talk to a couple of underwriters about this, and they said, but there's a very powerful correlation between the FICO score and hazard with, say, personal auto insurance. I said, but that's the generalized linear model. I said, that's just a regression. There's a guy named Judea Pearl, who's very famous for inventing the Bayesian belief networks. And he says it this way: you know that there's a strong, almost perfect relationship between eating citrus fruits and not getting scurvy. But if you don't know what the causal relationship is, which is vitamin C, what do you do when you run out of oranges? Do you eat bananas? And it's a very powerful statement, because regression analysis and correlations only take you so far, but you have an obligation to look a little farther than that. It's just, I just think the whole thing of using credit scores for insurance is just a terrible burden on the working poor. It's just not fair. Oh, and that's the word she used. It's not fair.
So I guess you mentioned regulators, and one thing the industry has managed to do is build up rules regarding, how we protect against solvency, how we that adds to the cost of insurance, because you have to include solvency margins. There's all these regulations around solvency, and yet what the CJ was asking for, and I think you've written a bit about, Neil, is why don't we come up with any regulations around not being biased? Why can't we do that? Is that the? I think you've said recently. We talked a lot about ethics. You wrote the paper 18 months ago, but not a lot has changed. People, individuals are generally ethical. They certainly all think they're ethical. There may be some exceptions, but people think they're ethical. But they're part of a bigger machine. And when you add it all up, we still have a problem in the industry that needs to be addressed. Am I sort of putting words in your mouth, or do you agree with that, Neil?
No, that's fine. But I did an analysis of this, and at one point I came up with 15 different types of bias. There isn't just one type of bias, but they all have one thing in common, and that is you can't solve bias computationally, because bias is a human thing. You have to attack it from the human perspective. Now, there are a lot of tools out there, and better tools coming, that can look at data and look at combinations of data and warn you about biased relationships. But it's really up to people to not use biased tools, because ultimately, the biased tools are always going to affect the people who can afford to be affected the least. And that's just the way it is. And the other thing is, I'm not a life actuary, but I look at these numbers and I hear that something like the people in the United States are $15 trillion underinsured in life insurance. And if I were an underwriter, I would want to be looking for ways to get people covered, not denied. And I think this has a lot to do with that. But the problem with the machine learning models is they look for recognizable patterns, and they see everything else as anomalies or errata. And that's why you run into problems with
it. When you say there's, so many different types of bias, but there's also a lot of ways you can go insolvent. There's a lot of problems that can happen financially once you issue a policy. So, it feels like we sort of have a lot of very intelligent people doing scenario testing and long tail, looking at the tails of scenarios, building up rules to set up reserves and solvency margins. Don't you think that the problem, we could look at bias in the same way?
Look, here's the problem. Bias simply means that there is a tendency towards something that may or may not be desirable. So it's so ineffable that I don't know how you could really do that. But I think it depends on on good practice and goodwill. I mean, there's some things that are just so obvious, right? You and I have talked about this, Kevin. The whole thing about gender, in life insurance. Well, women live longer than men, but if you break it down into classifications, you might find out that some classifications of women do and some classifications of women don't. And by the time you get down to these minute classifications, you're going to bring in so many variables that I don't think you're going to, it's just, you're not going to see the forest for the trees. And that's the way it is. But when you talk about bringing in data from external sources, every file you add to a file brings in more bias. And that's a whole technique. That's a whole, what you need people, you need a data infrastructure that can take care of that can spot the obvious things. But in terms of your underwriting rules and your actuarial analysis, I think it's just hopeful that people will understand that decision-making computers are dangerous to people and they need to have extra care.
Just to add to that, Neil, what do you think about some companies or some organizations using data scientists as data architects? Do you think these are like two very different fields, and the people who are data scientists and people who are data architects should be very different and not the same person doing both things at the same time? Do you think it somewhere compromises on that ethics part of it?
Well, my experience is most people who are titled data scientists are really data architects. They don't really spend very much time on data science. They spend most of the time trying to wrangle the data. No, I believe that in building a system that's going to go out there and affect people, it takes a team of people. You can't have just one person sitting at a computer and building a machine learning algorithm or a neural network to figure something out. That's terrible. So you have to have guardrails. If you're using this technology, these are the things you have to do.
So the other debate that's that's existed since Actuary started looking at predictive analytics has been, we brought it in and tried to be like data scientists, and we said, let's learn all these skills, and yet actuaries have a lot to offer that data scientists don't offer. We have the broader business experience, we have ethics built into our organizations. Our governing organization and credentials, an ongoing education requirement that includes professionalism. So I echo what Neil says. It takes a team, and I think we may have overshot as actuaries to try to become data scientists and do everything. Working with data scientists and actuaries working together and looking at the bigger picture is needed.
Well, I agree with that 100%. And I think I've said it 100 times too, that if you really want to be a data scientist or an AI engineer, you're probably going to have to give up your career as an actuary because it's going to consume everything. And as an actuary, you're exquisitely trained to do things that other people don't do. And I just don't, I understand it, it's interesting, it's sexy. I understand why some actuaries might think, I'd really like to get into this, this will be great. But I've got to tell you something. 10 years from now, there won't be any data scientists. It'll all be automated. And I don't think being an actuary will be automated.
I completely agree to that. The business sense which actually brings is something which can't be replicated, and that's actually the USP. And one more thing which I would like ask from both of you is, for every course, be it actuary or in general sense, everyone is taught a course called ethics and professionalism. So do you think it's enough to just teach a course and let people know that these are the rules or principles which makes out your ethics and professionalism, and then you just carry on with that, and once you reach the corporate world, all of them just remains words and in the books itself? So what do you think about how ethics and professionalism should be?
Before Neil says no, let me say yes. But no. I know what Neil's going to say, and I agree with Neil. But I don't think we should throw away what we teach in terms of ethics and professionalism. I think that's important, but it's not sufficient. So I think you sort of say, do we need this? It is needed, but it's not sufficient in my view. Neil I'll let you say no now.
Well, no, I agree exactly with what you said. And I have always admired the actuarial profession because of its stress on ethics and professionalism. You don't run into that in a lot of different professional kinds of societies. But I don't think you can teach ethics in a class or from a book or from a workshop. You either learn it as you grow up or you don't. And if you don't, you shouldn't be developing these systems because you're going to wreak havoc on society. I believe that ethics is too fungible. It's too effable. When we talk about ethics, there aren't any rules. There's a bunch of conversations. Well, I like it this way. I like it that way. So what ethics are you going to teach? I think the important thing is to teach people what to do and what not to do, driven from an ethical foundation.
I agree that, and I think it's worth mentioning that the societies like the Society of Actuaries and the other actuarial bodies, they it's not that they teach it and say let's go away and be ethical, and we don't, as Neil says, you have an ingrained sense of ethics through how you're raised, but what the societies do, what the profession does, is it provides a framework for discussion. We have regular meetings. I find it much better when it's in person. These topics can be discussed, and what I've seen, and I've been through the actual ethics training both in the UK and in the US. What I've seen is you get all these scenarios, and everybody does the right thing in theory. They'll say, yes, this is what you would do. But the theoretical examples that when I did it were very basic, and they were very black and white, and you would always give the right answer. They have made them a lot more nuanced now, and it's very hard to see what is where do you draw the line, where do you, and that's much more like reality. So I think the real value is not in teaching it at the time you do it. You can learn the tools, you can learn how you can test these things, but to be able to have a platform for debate and discussion and talk about case studies, which is ongoing continuing education provides. So I think that's very important.
So, I mean, if any closing comments you two would like to pass, since I guess like only 4 to 5 minutes left. So, any closing comments from you both?
I have a quote I wanted to use, and I haven't figured out where to put it in, so I'm going to say it now. About 10 years ago, I was having lunch with Esther Dyson, and she always says very interesting things. One of the things she said was, "Wait a minute, Neil. Let me introduce you to somebody. Bill, come over here." And she brings Bill Gates to the table. Anyway, that's not what I wanted to tell you about. She said that people come to social media not to give attention, but to get attention. And if you just think about that for a minute, it's kind of profound. So if you're going to use social media and scrape it for data, or use data that's scraped, you're always going to get data that's fake, because people on social media have a different persona than what they're really thinking. So that's, I see, as real danger. And actually, it's even more danger for natural language processing, because that's the primary source of data they use to train those NLP models.
Thanks. So I'm not going to give any profound quotes or anything to close, but I would just like to say that this paper and will be in the link, but there's a lot of research on the SOA website that's worth looking at. If you go under research, you can find it by topic. We're looking at doing a research paper on emerging techniques and tools in underwriting. I've been very heavily involved in the innovation type of research and insurtech research. So you can find all that on the SOA website, soa.org. And I'm sure there's others at the other actuarial bodies as well. But it's worth looking at. If people haven't been there for a while, visit the website, click on research, and then find the topics. Just browse it.
And I'll put a link to that in the description below. You can check it out.
If you allow me, there was There was one other thing, that I wanted to add that I think is foundational, and that is that that AI can cause substantial harm, in myriad domains. And the thing is, it's often surprising, even to the designers of the systems. And my feeling is, it's not the algorithms, it's not the implementation, it's the data. It's always the data. Come back to the data, because basically that's what a machine learning algorithm is. But I do believe that when things go sideways, even the designers go, "Oh my God, I had no idea."
Thank you for this insightful discussion. Thank you both of you for coming on this. And if you people want this content more, please share, like, and subscribe. And I put all the links in the description. You can go check out the survey as well as other research, as Kevin mentioned.